Welcome to the No Hard Feelings podcast. I'm Will,
I am Parker.
and today we are talking about the Stoned Ape theory, and we're also going to be talking a little bit about drugs, and we might move on to like some things about intelligence and kind of like modern society, but mainly the Stoned Ape theory. So just as like a quick purview, the Stoned Ape theory is essentially the idea that psilocybin, not specifically psilocybin, but like psychedelic mushrooms in general, were a large part of our evolution and a large part of why our brains developed the way they did and as quickly as they did. Um, and so I guess I'm just gonna go ahead and throw this to you. When was this proposed? Who was it proposed by? Is there any recent research being done on it? Kind of elaborate on what the Stoned Ape theory is.
Yeah, so in 1992, Terence McKenna published a book called Food of the Gods, which is where a lot of our discussion is going to be based in. And Terence McKenna is more known as like a psychonaut, psychedelic philosopher more than anything because he didn't do research with, a university or anything. He just kind of proposed radical ideas based on his experience and the traveling that he did into different countries to kind of try to get some of the indigenous uses of these medicines and understand how they were used by the tribes that have been using them for thousands of years rather than like the modern use by the Western society. um, so as Will said, the Stone Ape theory is the idea that these psilocybin mushrooms were the catalyst for the change from humans in pre-societal terms, pre-civilization terms to where we are today. And I think a good place to start here is that one of the big questions that people who study history and archaeology and such have really researched is, or at least looked into, is so 2 million years ago we had this extreme jump in the size of the human brain, and we don't really know why. There's certainly numbers of theories as to why it could be. Some people associate it to diet, but one of the leading theories is definitely social intelligence being the biggest reason for that. And a big part of social intelligence, specifically for humans, because we're so much more interested in other humans than other animals are in other animals or other animals of the same species, is that we have language. So language is kind of a big, it's arguably the biggest factor in the reason that we've gotten to the development that we have as a species. So if we're trying to figure out how humans were able to create language and put down the structure for this um, form of communication that's absolutely essential for sharing ideas and spreading knowledge generally to other people and keeping that knowledge within from generation to generation, as opposed to other species that don't really, they're not as capable of sharing some knowledge, or at least specific kinds, because humans are much more likely to mimic other humans, especially from a younger age, which is something that isn't as seen in other species. The species try to do it, like specifically apes, they'll try to do similar tasks, but in kind of their own way, while humans will just straight up do exactly what they saw in the example. And the fact that we do that, we keep these ideas getting passed down, and specifically with language being the biggest one. So, like language, for example, in humans is not something that is always being acquired. It's not something that um, is it's inherent. It's inherent, but it's inherent in the very early stages of human development, which is really interesting. Um, Now, I don't necessarily think that that's super prominent to necessarily the conversation we're having here, which is kind of the idea of how psilocybin mushrooms may have been the catalyst for either language development or our focus on social communication and intelligence. Um, so one of the questions that I have is, what are some of the effects of psilocybin that may have helped in this catalyzation of the promotion of language and the change of human focus from individual survival to group survival.
Yeah, so I also would like to preface all of this. Probably should have said this first thing. I know that you already know this, but anything or anybody who claims that a large part of human development, or really a large part of anything that's notable, is like one thing, is not a reliable source. And so, it's not, we're not sitting here saying that psychedelic mushrooms are the reason that we're like as intelligent as we are, or anything like that. We're just saying that it could have been one of the catalysts, along with the fact that we were being exposed to tons of new environments, new animals, new groups of people, lots of things. We're essentially just proposing that this is a piece of it. And so what I'm going to be talking about right now is going to be kind of the the modern uh, things that we see in humans' brains whenever they are under the effects of psilocybin, or other psychedelics, and those that also correlate with the parts of our brains that developed so drastically in that time span that Parker is talking about. Um, so the main things are that psilocybin has, now this is, a lot of these are at different dosages, but at low doses you have an increased visual acuity, specifically with edge detection, which would have been really useful during foraging and hunting. You have an increased capacity for empathy, which is really important for social cohesion, cooperation. And then a part of the next thing, which is that psilocybin also produces this idea that you have greater feelings of yourself, or greater than yourself, whether it be oneness with the universe, whether it be oneness with other people around you, whatever it is. It kind of promotes these greater feelings, which is, as Parker talked about, like a beneficial thing for the development of society and social cohesion. Now, the most like raw chemical aspects of what psilocybin does in a modern human's brain is it has a pretty drastic catalyst for neuroplasticity, which is really important for learning and developing and coming up with new ideas or approaching things from a different angle. And obviously, that could be incredibly beneficial for a species that's, like I said, seeing new environments and having to come to terms with finding new food sources and new shelters, and it's essentially just increased adaptability. It also has a effect on neurogenesis, which could be a part of why our brains increased in size if we were eating these things frequently. And it's not just psychedelic mushrooms; regular mushrooms also produce or promote neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. So like if we were eating these, and even if they were only like a third of the mushrooms that we were eating, it still would have had a large impact on the fact that our brains would have been growing and developing along with this diet. And then the two things that, or sorry, the last thing that I would really hammer on is kind of this like twilight state thinking, emotional processing, almost like the removal of the ego, kind of the non-identification of the self, which kind of plays into like the greater than oneself idea. So that's a large part of it, because emotional processing is really, really important for survival. Now in our current day and age, we're kind of removed from what emotions are and what they really mean and blah blah blah, because it's kind of just like well, I there are things that I would like to feel, there are things I wouldn't like to feel, there's certain things that I would like to start to adjust and have my perspective be different. But that's not what emotions are. Emotions are signals of the environment around you. And so things like fear and anxiety can be useful in a context where you have the potential of being eaten by a lion. The example I always like is, we have like a negative bias, because if I hear that bush over there rustle and I think to myself and I go, well, that's a lion, and so I run away from it every time, there's no impact to that other than maybe wasted energy. But if the time that I don't decide to run away from it, it is a lion, well, now I am dead. So like we have all of these biases and things that are developed over the course of not living in what is modern society. And so psilocybin or other psychedelics could have helped start to develop society in the sense that it was removing you from some of those emotions, in like the literal sense of, we know that psilocybin interacts in parts of the brain that cause anxiety, but the parts of the brain that cause anxiety are also things that cause things like gratitude, and you can't actually be grateful and anxious at the same time. We've done studies on this. And so, lots of these little things could have been extremely useful for, ancient human beings and developing societies, specifically like social cohesion. And then, you obviously touched on language. And we know that LSD works on the temporal lobe, which is what we think is largely responsible for like auditory processing and a part of what is responsible for language development. And so it would make sense that all of these things that are interacting in our brains this way now would have possibly been the cause of what allowed our brain to develop to this point. And so, we've talked about psilocybin now, and what one thing we haven't mentioned is that psilocybin specifically interacts with one molecule in the brain, and it's the serotonin receptor, the 5-HT2A receptor, which is one of the main serotonin receptors, at least that I'm aware of, in terms of just like the actual production and way that serotonin interacts with the brain. So, kind of what is serotonin? Like what does it do? What is it responsible for? Kind of just give us an explanation of that, because psilocybin almost perfectly mimics serotonin, which is really interesting because obviously that I would think that has to have some sort of correlation.
So, yeah, serotonin's one of the key neurotransmitters that we have in our brain, and it's often tied to anxiety and depression. And that's why you see people taking selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which is just put simply, it affects with the serotonin system and the body to hopefully assist in reducing anxiety or depression. And the reason that it's specifically, the reason that the serotonin is so important is its similarities to psilocybin and psilocin. And psilocin is just the active component of psilocybin. So psilocybin is that's the majority component you have from a magic mushroom, and when you consume it, it's broken down into psilocin. So the only difference between serotonin and psilocybin is the fact that it is, how do I explain this that simply? It's a little tough to explain how simple the difference is, but pretty much there's a phosphate group, which in chemistry is just a very small portion of a bigger structure that's attached to a different carbon than it usually is in the serotonin molecule. And then when that's broken down into psilocin, the only difference between psilocin and serotonin is the fact that there is a hydrogen and a nitrogen that are bind to a different carbon than they are with serotonin. So it's literally just moving two molecules just over in the chemical structure. So they're nearly identical. And when it actually binds to the receptor, it can bind at 1,000-fold the affinity, which means that the receptor and psilocin are really, really magnetized to bind together, which is really, really fascinating because it has a higher affinity than serotonin itself does. So that's
I didn't
something
actually
that's,
realize that. That's pretty cool.
yeah, no, it's absolutely insane. That's what's been done in some of the recent in vitro studies that are outside of the actual brain. So it is, it's not perfectly relatable to vivo inside the brain studies. But what's fascinating is that system is really important for anxiety and depression. So if that system is being altered and we don't have that anxiety about these possible scared or near death moments, like with the tiger, you're able to actually take in a lot more stimuli. And that's something that we see with psilocybin is that it reduces our default mode network, which is pretty much just a system in our brain that is a consistent filter that is limiting the amount of stimulus that our bodies intake. Because if we intook every bit of stimulus that we are exposed to, we'd be overwhelmed and not very capable of doing many things. So that's why we need to make assumptions. Our brain needs to make assumptions to be able to survive. But we're in a but if you were to take psilocybin, the survival mechanisms in your brain that make all those assumptions that reduce the stimuli is actually limited. So you are exposed to a lot more stimuli, giving you the capability to be able to maybe communicate a new idea, be exposed to a new idea, empathy, like you were referring to, you'd be able to, realize what other people are feeling. And so this all ties into the idea of social connectivity and uh, propagation of continual communication because of the benefits that you can get from social interaction. And one of the big things is that when our brains grew, one of the big things that was different between our brain size or our brain makeup and other brains across the world is that our neocortex ratio is astronomical compared to other species. And what this means is that the cortex, which is kind of like the top layer of our brains, which is heavily associated with language, higher processing, so like ideas of the self and being able to comprehend others, like empathy, those things were in the midst of growing as our brains were getting larger because they grew to an astronomical degree that they hadn't ever before in the last 2 million years. And even more, the closer it got to modern day, the faster our brains have actually grown. And because that ratio is so significant, so the higher processing part of our brain, and compared to the volume of our entire brain, is so much higher than other species, it gives us the capability to be a lot more social. So if psilocybin was, promoting neurogenesis, promoting the production of neurons, and we were getting a higher processing, in our brains were increasing specifically in positions that increase sociability, then what we're really doing is setting us up to be more social creatures, as we've seen we are. And if we're more social creatures, it gives us the capability to spread ideas and share different things that other species aren't, because that's our big advantage, is we're able to communicate so efficiently and so effectively with one another. Now, this is the effect of psilocybin that we've seen throughout our ancestors, and if we're track back the brain size for millions of years. So that's pretty fascinating to see, and it could be totally a catalyst for where we are today and where we've changed historically. But I am also curious about some of the other substances that I've seen to be normalized in human tradition, and other concepts or other ideologies that could pop up because of psilocybin. So I'd like to ask you, well, what kind of things do you think could be a result of the use of psilocybin, and do you think I'm also curious what you think about the differences between psilocybin use in modern day, as well as other intoxicants or things that induce altered states of consciousness.
I would love to answer that. My dogs are going crazy right now. Can you
Oh,
hear them?
I thought that's what you were laughing at.
Huck, cut it out, buddy. All right. Sorry everybody. Sorry the two people that is you and me that are watching this.
Yeah, yeah, and liking it. Don't worry.
And maybe the one guy that accidentally clicks onto it.
Yeah, immediately gets out of it.
Okay, come on, guys. Give me 1 second. There's literally not a single thing outside. There's not even a bird moving.
They're just working.
She's literally looking at me barking. Okay. Sorry. But yeah, so I mean we have used a ton of substances throughout our history. I mean, and I think it's important to also kind of like shift the perspective on what we mean by substance, because a lot of times that immediately gets interpreted as something like alcohol or weed or heroin. And I think it's funny because we don't think about the fact that everything that we consume is a substance. Like whether it be something as simple as like a fruit juice, or whether it be something that's like an everyday thing like caffeine for most people, or obviously I think most people think of nicotine as a substance, but almost everything that we consume is a substance, other than like if you really wanted to get technical with it, even water, it's a substance. And so all of this has effects on our mental state. Like water is a perfect example. If you drink a lot of water, you have massive impacts on your physiological and psychological state, because your brain and your body function off of a ridiculous amount of water. Glucose, your brain functions a ton off of glucose. And so by having glucose, you are changing your mental state. Now, it's obviously not going to be as extreme as something like heroin or psilocybin. And I'm not trying to put those two together. They are absolutely not together. But, just in a broad class of what substances are, I think it's important to just think about the fact that literally everything we consume and everything that affects us is a substance. It's just that it affects us differently, and some of it is more like like a more systemic almost effect where, like, for instance, water, your entire body's made up of water, you need water, so having water affects your mental state in a good way because you need water. Whereas,
It just produces an altered state of consciousness that comparatively to where you were before. If you
exactly.
were starving or you were low in glucose, consuming that glucose will give you lots of energy, which is a different state of consciousness than you were in the moment before.
Exactly. And, like, glycogen is huge for your muscles. Like, you have all of these effects from almost anything that you're eating or drinking or smelling. And um, so, you have lots of substances, and substances that have been used forever. You have, you can trace things like the cocoa leaf and opium use, and even things like tobacco, as far back as, a lot of the societies, specifically in, the Native American tribes, they used tobacco for a lengthy period of time. Now, they used it differently than we do. They hadn't synthesized it and hadn't put nicotine in it, and, it was a different substance essentially than it is now. But, we've been using it forever. And same thing with, like, cacao leaves in South America have been used forever to help with certain mental sharpness, and as well as, it actually, you still chew on cacao leaves whenever you go to see, like, Machu Picchu,
Hmm.
because it helps with acclimatizing to the area. And so, like, substances are a huge part of human history, and throughout most of that history, those substances have just been essentially the plants that the chemicals are now derived from. And I think it's important, you can start to recognize the shift from these, like, what we would call, plant medicines or just plant substances into these synthesized versions. So, you had things like, mead, which was you could call that synthesized, but usually mead was essentially just fermented honey. Um, and that was a large part of how people, drank alcohol until we started to synthesize grains and things like that. And then we had, like I've already mentioned, the opium plant, which was used for a long time before we started synthesizing that into things like opioids and heroin. And we had the cacao leaf, which before it was synthesized into cocaine was used. And I think there's a very clear shift in how these substances have affected the societies. And so I think a really easy one is one that I've already brought up. Native American tribes, and also in Asia, they actually had, they had marijuana plants, but, they didn't have marijuana in the same way that we do now. They weren't smoking it even out of a pipe, which is funny because, I think a lot of people that smoke probably think about that as like one of the older ways to smoke weed, whereas it actually wasn't. They would actually get the resin from the plant and then eat the resin. And so it's actually, this is kind of cool because I think it ties into what I'm going to talk about. The male marijuana plant doesn't actually make the resin. And so only the female marijuana plant makes the resin. And so you kind of see what, going back to the food of the gods thing, Terence McKenna proposes this idea that before alcohol and before essentially these synthesized substances, we had a pre-dominator society mold. And what he means by a dominator society mold is that there's a dominant group, like a very specific group. It can be a gender, it can be a race, it can be a like a class, it can be a workforce, whatever it is. A specific group that apparently has all these advantages and controls the way that the societal expectation and functions operate. And so his model is that, specifically psilocybin and mushrooms and psychedelics were like kind of the original pre-dominator society mold, and that's why it, seemed to be so much more cohesive. The Naftufians is the group that he mentions a lot in Food of the Gods, and that group is notable for the fact that they didn't necessarily have a male dominant society or a female dominant society. The warriors were, and all of this is kind of supposed. A lot of this, I'm just talking about what Terence talks about, not even making any truth claims. But his claims are that the warrior class would have essentially been the same level as like the farming class or the foraging class or the shamanistic class, which that's a little different because the shamans would have always been kind of this different, like higher level of like wisdom and knowledge, but they weren't necessarily viewed as like actually better. It was just that they had information and wisdom that other people didn't have. And you kind of start to move to this dominator society, as he calls it, which is heavily influenced specifically by alcohol. And, a lot of people think, the modern day substances are essentially nicotine, tobacco, caffeine, and alcohol. but a lot of people throw weed into that too now because marijuana has become super prevalent. What I think an important distinction to make before I actually get into this is that one of the reasons that weed, at least for him, is not considered a part of the dominator society model is that anything that he would consider, and that I think we would as well consider an introspective, a twilight state of mind, which is kind of this introspective state of mind, a twilight state of mind that's caused by any substance can no longer fit into the dominator model because it means that you have to be questioning things. Whereas the dominator model is supported and influenced by the fact that you are not supposed to question things. And so that's why I'm not going to be really talking about weed specifically. I should be saying hashish because, weed, like marijuana and what hashish is, are technically different. The resin of it is a different compound, I think, and it does definitely have different psychological effects. It's supposed to be more introspective. And so it doesn't really fall into this dominator mold.
Yeah, I'd also like to throw in there that the biggest kicker is the difference in awareness. Like, you'll be hyper aware through the use of marijuana, psychedelics, but you'll be much less aware and have much less inhibition when you're under the influence of alcohol, as well as crap. What was my point going to be? Oh yeah, when you consume weed or marijuana, I presume that this is the same for the resin as it is for like modern day edibles. When you consume it, it's actually broken down into a slightly different chemical compound that is actually more similar to a psychedelic than it is to traditional marijuana. So that also is more fitting for how that tribe would have been using it at the time.
Exactly. And that's kind of whenever I was saying introspection, that's what I meant, is just like this level of awareness, specifically this level of this higher, processing self-awareness, where instead of just thinking about like, we can process the fact that I exist, but it's a different level to process the fact that I am a being and I have control over the things that I do. And there might be things that I'm doing that I'm actually not okay with doing, purely for the sake of the fact that I don't think it's necessarily the right way to do it. And things like psychedelics and marijuana, and then things like other I know that this is technically not classified as a psychedelic, but like even things like MDMA, ketamine, these are all substances that produce that twilight state thinking. And twilight state thinking is usually, and we can even track this through modern American history, twilight state thinking is usually kind of anti-dominator society. Like, for instance, the revolution in the 60s and 70s, whether it be from the psychedelics or from the weed, you had this large pushback against the government. You had things like the civil rights movement that actually, now that started previously, obviously, but it got a large jump of support. Feminism really, if you really want to label when feminism started to make a large amount of progress, after World War II, it was during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which is when all of these psychedelics and marijuana were becoming prevalent in our society. So just kind of as an example of the fact that it breaks down what is supposed to be the dominator society, because it typically causes different, not necessarily better, not necessarily worse, just a different type of thought. And so, where I'm really trying to get with all of this extra explanation is the fact that we have slowly transitioned as a species from essentially plant substances, because it's all our ancient ancestors didn't know how to synthesize cacao leaves into cocaine. Like, they didn't have the ability to. Even if they did know how to, they didn't have the equipment or anything. And so we've slowly transitioned from this plant substance into these synthesized things. And we can start to see this in Rome, where you had a huge, and in Greece too, but you had a huge prevalence of even the slightest difference of people switching over from mead, which, like I talked about, is usually made from honey, into alcohol, an actual like wine, which was an actual synthesized product. It was fermented grapes, and then usually beer, which is from grains, and bourbons and things like that. That started to be synthesized over. And as you watch the process of it synthesizing, you follow, again, what he would call this dominator society mold of becoming less conscious, more competitive, I think is a good way to describe it too. How it's kind of this like, not even just every man for himself, but every group for themselves. There's kind of this zero-sum game of success. And we've talked about the zero-sum thing before with empathy. But I think the dominator society also pushes this zero-sum game of success, which is that, just to use stupid examples from our modern politics, is, if if the Democratic Party has maintained a level of control over the Senate for 10 years, then the Republican Party and maybe even the Independent Party feels like not only do they have to get into the Senate, which that's reasonable, but they actually have to take it from the Democrats instead of just, entering into it and being a part of it. And so you have this zero sum, extremely competitive nature that's promoted by things like alcohol. As you said, alcohol, and I mean, we can actually track this with neuroscience. It removes your inhibitors for certain social activities and risky behavior. And so what that's essentially doing is it's not necessarily making you, it's not like you think to yourself, oh, this is a really stupid activity, but I'm going to do it anyways because, I'm somehow better at doing it right now. It's literally that you're not thinking about the fact that it actually is a really dumb behavior. Now, you might have a slight awareness of the fact that's not something that you would usually do, but you're not truly aware of it because it's removing those things that you typically have. And so these substances that we've transitioned into, like heroin, like cocaine, like alcohol, even things that have been even more synthesized, like crack and like fentanyl, all of these things are what we would consider almost like super dopey drugs. And what that really means is that it stops allowing you to be truly aware. And whenever you can't be truly aware, you are so much more susceptible to certain things like social contagions. You're so much more susceptible to, things like groupthink, like societal beliefs, and viewing them as an objective reality. In general, I've kind of rambled on. I didn't mean to, but because it's kind of a weird topic. I'm having a hard time really wrapping it up like nicely. But in general, the way that substances of use has changed drastically, and I think the main cause of not the only cause, but the main cause of that substance use going from like this ritualistic, aware, altered state of conscious type use into this, what we would consider kind of now this like party, escapism. That's the best way to describe it. Is it's moved from awareness to escapism, and I think it's mostly because of the fact that human beings have synthesized these drugs essentially into something that we can no longer handle. The difference between opium and heroin, to the average person, doesn't feel like very much. If you look at the difference between an opium plant and what heroin is, in the way that it interacts in your brain, the difference is massive. And so, I think this is kind of be our kind of like final talking point. So I just want to throw it on to you and say, like, is there anything else that you think specifically about the progression of drugs? Is there anything that you think specifically at the way that modern culture views drugs, uses drugs? Just I should say substances, but I'm gonna kind of just toss the same question you asked over to you.
Yeah, we're in a weird state with substances. A lot of miseducation, a lot of misunderstanding. People considering, drugs is such an interesting word because we put every substance into one word. Yet, if you give that word a bit of context, it completely alters people's perception of it. So, if you're talking about prescription drugs, people are like, okay, you're just getting help for medical needs. If you're talking about, but the funny thing about that is, nowadays you can medically prescribe marijuana. So it's a prescribed drug. But yet 20 years ago, and especially 50 years ago, you were a high-time criminal if you were found with the same substance. And a lot of this has to do with, what the dominator societies would have implemented to keep their population in a similar status of lack of awareness. So if they're making the substances that give you these altered states of consciousness that widen your perspective and give you a greater birth of awareness, removing that from the legal field of accessibility. So the population only really has access to things that remove inhibition and put you into more of a dopey state, like Will's referring to. If that's all you have access to legally, then you're going to be, assuming you're following the law, because that's kind of what dominator societies are built on, and also modern societies. We have societies that are obviously too large that if you didn't have law, there'd be many problems tied to that. But
Anarchy, baby.
there's places it could work. If you have a small enough population, it's possible. But that's not really anarchy. But that's not really important. Yeah. regardless, if the population's only exposed to things that are removing their inhibition and putting them more into a position to follow the norm, then that's what's going to happen. And you're going to have, the top elites making sure, not even necessarily the elites, could be just the government itself, making sure that certain substances aren't getting back into the population that actually expand awareness. At least this is just a radical claim of how it could have possibly gone down due to much of the pushback on psychedelics and marijuana being done right during the period of people being anti-Vietnam War, people being, oh, I just kind of want peace and love, no matter how hippie it is. That's kind of what we're pushing for here. And the government was like, well, we got a war to fight, so this isn't really helping our cause. And also, if people are going to be this aware and this anti-government because of the substances that they currently have access to, let's stop the research and let's stop the access. And unfortunately, that does
And let's
seem.
also, I know you're implying this, but I think it's important to just say it out loud too. Not only just stop it, but let's actively stigmatize and demonize the substances so that even if you do have access to them, like then the entire other society has essentially shunned you for using something.
And one of the biggest examples of that is one of the ads that pretty much everyone today has seen is the rotten egg, or the egg being cooked in the frying pan, and the claim that this is your brain on drugs. I mean, that is just the most ridiculous thing that's ever been claimed. There's so much research that shows that that's not the case. A lot of that research even happened before. There was lots of research done in the 50s and 60s, or maybe not 60s, but 50s at least, proposing the benefits of these, medicines that just got completely pushed away. All of the research got stopped, and like you're saying, these institutions were literally putting your job on the line if you were like, oh, I think I should still continue to do this research because of the absolutely amazing benefits and results that we've seen. Yet the institutions and the government were unfortunately just proposing that we stick to the substances that we know, and regardless of the fact that we've had this phenomenal research done, it just doesn't align with the capitalistic ideals that were promoted at the time. So we're definitely in a beautiful era where that's being shifted back to, we're going to be able to do research and such. And that's why we actually, decided to discuss this today, because a recent paper came out revisiting the Stoned Ape theory and proposing evidence as to why it could be the case. Because Dennis McKenna, Terrence's brother, actually did some research in Brazil analyzing people who took ayahuasca consistently and those who didn't take it consistently. And those who took it consistently had increases in neurofunctioning on the different cognitive tests that they had them taking.
And we've done that with rats with psilocybin, and they also do better on the mental tests that we put them through.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely fascinating when you really compare and contrast the minimal research that we currently have, but what it says that is capable with these substances.
And I think we were talking about the fact that this is. I know that this isn't the way that you meant it, but you threw this thing out where it's like, this is kind of like a radical proposition of what the government was doing with psychedelics and weed. And I think, and maybe this is because I tend to be a little bit more extreme than you are. I think it would actually be fair to not even say it's radical. I think it would be fair to say that in terms of at least a part of it, you can 100% claim that is why, again, at least just a piece of it, you can 100% claim is why the government doesn't want these drugs to be legalized. Is our own government, the CIA, was doing experiments with this, and we can talk about MK Ultra another day. There's a lot to talk about, but our own government was doing experiments with this in the hopes of mind controlling people, and they actually, like, one of the papers associated with MK Ultra even came out and essentially said, not only can we not figure out how to mind control people with this, it feels like it actually gives us less control over them than we might have initially had. And so, like, if your society is a full of people who are uncontrollable, or okay, I shouldn't say that, but are not controlled and are aware, that is an extremely dangerous society for the government doing negative things to the society. Now,
Dominating.
exactly. Now, if the government is doing what the government should do, which is supporting the individual on every level that it can, and promoting things like entrepreneurship, and because you said capitalism, but I do tend to like capitalism, at least in a society as large as the USA, as long as it's done correctly. And I know you just meant like the modern aspect of over
The
consumerism.
U.S. economy is specifically what I was referring to.
Yeah, I know. And so like, promoting entrepreneurship, promoting creativity, promoting, all of these different things. If the government's doing that, then why would they have any issue with their people being aware and being uncontrolled? Because that, if you really boil it down, that is what, and I, not to get like nationalistic here, but like that specifically, that's what like America was pre World War One. We broke away. It was such a small group of people. We broke away. We were anti the current government. We were anti the comparatively to now, the absolutely minimal tax. We left the UK for a 2% tax. That's why we left. We were so, now it was also religious stuff, but like we left because of a 2% tax. That's how like anti the American people started out as. We were doing things like we had floorboards that were 23 inches long instead of 24 inches long, because anything that was 24 inches long belonged to the king. We were so unique and so independent, and we were doing things. We, before the cotton gin was invented, we were on our way to to criminalizing slavery and things like that. But we were doing things the correct, I shouldn't say that, but
Progressive, the
a
progressive way.
progressive non-dominator society mold. And then things like the cotton gin and alcohol and all these other government regulations,
Industrialization was a big
and
part of it.
exactly, came in and has kind of swamped our ability to be what I would consider like, and I know we're kind of focusing on America right now. I would imagine that the majority of our audience is going to be American, considering that it's going to be you, me, and one other guy. Is like, we've stripped ourselves of our own identity, and the government has helped us do that. Now, it's not that the government did it for us, but they have helped us do it. If we as a society rose up and said like, these substances are important, these or at least the access to them are important. These substances are not what you've told us. The stupid newspaper articles in the 70s saying that people were taking LSD and staring into the sun or jumping out windows. People still believe that. Like, I was talking to an actual doctor 5 days ago, and I mentioned to him that I was interested in this. And one of the things he said is, he's like, yeah, but you're gonna need a medical license because of those people that they take LSD and they jump out of windows. And I was like, dude, that's not true. That's propaganda. And we've allowed ourselves to become so unaware that even the propaganda that is pushed to us, we're not even aware that it's propaganda.
Yeah, we're in a tough position nowadays where we're also so we have so much accessibility to all this different information that it's hard to distinguish what's accurate and what's not. And a lot of the stories that were told back when, no one really doubted the credibility of the information coming in because there was no reason to doubt the government. Those stories have remained specifically in, the older generations, and they're kind of one of the big things that ties into the I guess the identities that those folks associate with. And because of their association with that story, they no longer believe that these medicines could have any purpose or anything productive, and they just see it as an intoxicant. Um, yeah, I think we're in a weird place where we need to be promoting research, promoting actual science, so that we can push as far away from random ideology and as close as we can to um, quote unquote truth based on our legitimate trial and error, rather than presumption or what seems to be good or bad for the people at the top instead of the people in general.
And I think you could even make it as broad as you wanted and take away science and just be like, we just need to be promoting awareness. I don't care if you're just aware of things in a sense of not a scientific way, not like you shouldn't be, but like if you're just aware of things in a different type of philosophy, almost a more like Eastern medicine philosophy way, which there we can still do science on that. I'm not saying you can't. There's just like there's certain things that are almost removed a little bit from science, like politics. It's just about being aware. Try your best to have the good information, and try your best to be, even if you think that something is objectively one way, try your best to remove that objectivity, because nothing in this world, at least, I mean, I haven't been alive for very long, but like nothing in this world as I've seen it yet is objective.
Everything
Nothing.
is extremely, extremely nuanced. There's so many components to every single thing going on. So to generalize something into one category, especially before actually, taking the time to get to understand what you're working with, is an absolute detriment. And that seems to what has happened due to the misunderstanding and the misinformation. I think like really the only radical part here is that I don't think we can confirm um, definitely the government took action to, what's even the word I'm thinking of? Suppress, that's what it is. Suppress psychedelics and marijuana and all these other substances that didn't align with their ideology. But the thing that we're being radical about is the intentions of the government being to keep people in a sheep-like state that allows them to be used for the
I
benefit of
mean,
the government.
what if I could drop a presidential quote on you that gave us
Is
a
this
little bit more
Nixon?
credibility? Yeah.
What did Nixon say?
Nixon said, "Do you want to know what the war on drugs was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. Do you understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know that we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did."
He said that in 1996.
I don't know when I can't remember when he said it, but he was talking about his campaign in '68.
I think that's where you end it. I don't think there's anything else we can say.
I
I
don't
think
think there
that,
is, man.
wow, Jesus Christ. I have never heard that.
Yeah, scary,
Holy,
isn't it?
that's absolutely terrifying. That's not common knowledge.
Yeah,
And for someone who actively is doing lots of research in this field, for me not to be aware of that quote is Jesus.
mind-boggling, dude.
It's not that
I
I
feel
didn't
like I
already
just rocked your
presume
world.
It's not that I didn't presume the intentions, but I didn't know it was as blatant as what
Oh yeah,
that's
he just said
that's
it.
the most insane quote I've heard in my entire life.
It's
He literally
wild.
said they were anti-war left and anti-black people.
Well, then
That's
the
unfathomable.
last sentence of the quote is literally, "Did we know we were lying? Yeah, of course we did."
To promote anti-war or to promote pro-war and anti-black people. That's just
Oh, and okay, let me clarify. Technically, that Nixon didn't say this was John Ehrlichman, which was the assistant to him for domestic affairs. So it was like his direct assistant for public affairs.
I was gonna say for Nixon to say that seems unfathomable, but I'm not gonna act like that doesn't take away from the credibility.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty nuts.
Well, I think our audience should sit with that quote and think about it for at least like 3 months because that's the most unfathomable thing I've ever heard. I'm gonna have to think about that for at least 14 months because it takes me a while to wrap my brain around stuff like that. But oh my goodness, jeez,
I love
I think that's a good place to end it though.
yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Well, we'll see y'all fellers on another day. Um, You'll learn more about Nixon and his administration and what they've done.
You can do a lot of research on Nixon if you'd like to.
Yeah, I need to. All right, we'll end it
Okay,
there.
you can end it, but like I would also like to say, like this doesn't have to be part of it. You can hit it. Nixon, he was definitely not someone that I like, but he gets more